I understand that, you know, there's probably some gap in knowledge in terms of the whole history of that claim. So I just kind of wanted to walk through the process. Tolan Mechanical worked for the expert witness team and developed a report based on the claims that were identified in the construction defects. The district had filed a lawsuit against the design team and contractor, and ultimately that arrived in a financial settlement of about, I think, 1.7 million, 1.1 in December of 2019. At the time, Dave's firm and the engineers that were part of the expert team developed a kind of a proposed budget to repair all the defects. That was about 4.5 million. And so there was a pretty big gap between what it was going to take financially to resolve those items as of 2019 and what the district received in revenue from that lawsuit. The current project is really only, you know, probably 20%, 30% at best financial part of the work that is yet to be completed. The geothermal field replacement is the work that's being. Sorry, I just want to check that the mic is on. It's a little soft. You're good if you just speak a little bit more. Sure. Thank you. Sorry about that. The current project is roughly $2 million, and so that's used up 100% of the settlement dollars, and it's required some additional transfers from your general fund and other accounts to account for that work. It is a replacement of the existing geothermal field that failed, which was a main component of the lawsuit due to construction defects and other quality control issues. The other part of the lawsuit has to do with interior piping in the building, and Dave can talk a little bit about the technical nature of the PVC pipe breaking down and sort of the impact of those failures.
During the lawsuit, you know, it was determined that some value engineering had happened during the initial phases of construction. Steel pipe wasn't used in the school, so there's PVC pipe that's used throughout for the distribution of the geothermal loop, and that pipe is failing randomly and causes reliability issues, and will continue to probably fail until it's replaced. So that's the second phase of the project once the outside field work is complete. You know, there was two reasons for it that we proposed during came up with during the lawsuit. Was thermal expansion's an issue, and also the glycol mixture with the PVC and plastic just don't get along. So you got two factors that are contributing to you know, failures of that pipe, and when it does fail, the system goes down and all the fluid comes out, and it's kind of problematic. So
yeah, that's exactly right. So the initial thought for a resolution for that failure was to not only replace the field, but also go through a pretty extensive project of removing ceilings, both suspended grid ceilings, hard lid ceilings, and replacing hundreds and hundreds of feet of pipe in the main building. So at the end of the current project, we will have the heating source, being the geothermal, as well as the cooling source, resolved. But the interior piping would be the next sort of step for the district to take on to complete repairs. Unfortunately, as you're probably aware, we've seen a lot of escalation in costs over the last couple of years, and so we're sort of estimating that the cost to embark on the interior pipe replacement is significantly greater than even the original estimate that was completed in 2019. And so I think we wanted to kind of make you aware of the idea that the longer it goes without being repaired, the more risk there is of failures. And if you're not familiar, as Dave sort of mentioned, what happens is this PVC pipe randomly fails. It creates a flood condition. There's glycol in that system to keep the water from freezing. That becomes a lost instructional time for students, and you've got to bring in crews on an emergency basis to come in and make those repairs. So in order to be sort of proactive and get ahead of it, we really recommend a plan to fund that additional work. Right now, as a kind of big estimate, we're anticipating probably another 4 to 4.5 or 4.5 to almost $5 million. And so that's a pretty big chunk to bite off, certainly in one fell swoop. And I think that as we get into the details of executing that work, it's probably going to be difficult to complete that in the period of a single summer. And so, there's going to be some logistics to work through with respect to executing that work as quickly as possible.
Well, just to help me get in line with what I'm hearing, the original estimate in 2019 was roughly $4.5 million. We've spent $2 million in the current effort. Is that the bulk of it, or is there more to come on the current, or is that it? The 2 million.
Yeah, 2 million is on track.
It's on track to be within budget to finish the
Yep.
current work.
Yep.
Then I heard you say 4.5 to 5 million more to basically change out PVC pipe throughout the building.
Throughout the building.
4.5 to 5 million.
Yep.
Okay.
Just to clarify, is that to replace every single bit of PVC?
That is correct.
That would replace it all. And up until this point, have we just been doing portion by portion or as affected?
Yeah, that's right. Bob, you want to talk to that?
Oh, sure. I could speak to that because we have had a couple points of failure, and we have replaced and repaired those points of failure, but we have not tackled the entirety of the project. The entirety of the project is much more substantial, but when a point of failure does occur, I believe January of 2020 was the last point of failure. It was January 21st, I think, of 2020. It broke, and we ended up having to replace a whole lot of glycol. I can't remember how many gallons of glycol. Glycol's going for what this year?
Oh,
This
$15
minute.
a gallon at least.
$15
yeah.
a gallon.
So,
So
and
we replaced gallons of that, hundreds of gallons of that, because as you can imagine, those pipes run an entire length of a hall. So isolation of those is never very segmented.
So to secure the system, just so I understand what Mr. Taylor just went through, to secure the system, we want to replace all the PVC piping, ideally, as soon as possible, and make sure we have enough glycol, obviously, in that system. But it would be 2 million from the original estimate plus another 4.5 to 5 million.
Yeah,
So that's 6.5 to 7
that's correct.
million total.
That's correct. Total anticipated expense would be about $6.5 million.
And what is the time frame? Because you mentioned it's probably not doable over one summer.
Yeah, so there are a lot of logistics that we have to work through. Right now, I think the supply chain issues and material availability is a challenge, but likely 2 summers worth of time to replace
Okay.
that piping in portions. It's likely that smaller sections could happen. We could get in a situation where during a spring break, maybe we do a portion of it. But as we break it into smaller chunks, you start to lose some of those efficiencies and economies of scale
Sure.
that we would have if we could do it as a single project.
And if in between those 2 summers or in between those intervals when you're working, if there's another failure in another section, is that an additional cost or would that be covered
Yeah,
by?
that would just be additional kind of sunk operating expense.
But not additional to the 6.5 to 7 million?
It would be
It would
additional.
be, oh, okay.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm just trying to get a full scope of cost, possible cost.
Yeah.
Is there any other additional cost that could occur that you could foresee?
I think the difficult part is to sort of calculate what a failure would entail and what a spill response would be for that. To sort of paint a picture, you end up with a flood. And so depending on where it's at, you've got to clean carpet, floors, maybe even deal with ceiling damage and wall damage and repair. So it's a kind of a restoration, sort of emergency contractor response. Glycol in carpeting and sort of absorptive surfaces is really difficult to clean, and so you could be looking at carpet replacement. I don't know what the past spill responses have been, but I can imagine they're in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, we've gotten fairly lucky in the last two major breaks. Well, the last major break was back in January 2020. That was on a concreted area in a hallway. And we got lucky because it was right over the center of the hallway.
And how many breaks have there been since the system went in? And in what time frame is that?
Since inception, I think they started about 2015. Without an exact number on that, I think there were 3 more serious breaks. But they will continue to escalate because as the piping becomes older and becomes more brittle, the factor is that glycol turns PVC brittle. And with age, brittle tends to break more. And so the last break, 2020, the building's, 12 years old at that point, 13 years old. You could probably only foresee an escalation of those breaks occurring and a frequency increasing. I would say that I don't know what the studies have shown on how many years you have until point failure for all of it, but replacing all of the PVC with ductile, some sort of metal piping, is probably the next best step with that. The field that we replace now was failing. And since it drives the whole system, it had to be replaced because otherwise there is no heating and cooling in the building. We've got some backup boilers to do some heating, but there's definitely no cooling. So once that is replaced, that will provide the heating and the cooling. The next most logical point of failure is going to be the PVC piping. There are some additions into that where pump sizes and other things have to change as flow rates change and things like that, but that's a de minimis cost regard versus all the other stuff. Had it not been value engineered in 2007, 2008, and that had been regular steel pipe, we wouldn't be here.
Can you, it's more of a curiosity, what length of pipe is all of this that needs to be replaced?
It was thousands and thousands of feet. I mean, it's a lot.
It's most, if you can imagine the hallways around the entire perimeter of the lower section.
Wow.
And we're talking about PVC piping that ranges from, I think, 3-inch might be the smallest diameter up to as much as 8.
Mm-hmm.
So these are big pipe sizes. It's not, 1.5 inch PVC that you can easily route through the existing building. So where we have existing ductwork, fire sprinkler runs, electric conduit, all of those things that are in those ceilings, you've got to go in and extract this pipe in smaller sections and fish it back through. So it's really a surgical project. It doesn't have the same benefit of going in the proper sequence that it would have during new construction. And while I think the steel pipe is probably going to be the most reliable option, there are some new pipe materials that show to be likely of value, better cost, first cost over steel, but we aren't in a position today to make a recommendation that you go to something different that maybe doesn't have the same track record. But I think during the design process, we can look at those different material options that may increase speed for replacement and not have any sort of negative impact for durability or performance.
Especially given there's already some steel in there, correct?
There's the smaller diameters, I think, are mostly copper.
Yeah.
From below the 3-inch. So I don't think really any of the geothermal supply and return piping is steel.
Some of the repairs, I think, are steel, but you're talking about a
like
section of a
Band-Aids.
couple feet. And with the change to a piping material, some of the diameters need to change, so I'm not sure that those 4 or 5 repairs will be able to be salvaged, and it's minute to the total scope, so.
I think it'd be worth knowing what the different costs are for different materials, maybe, if that changes the total cost.
We would probably enter in that and see the difference in cost once we got to the point where we had the money set aside to do that, and we got into the design and purchase scope of that. You're probably talking, what, a couple $100,000 difference?
Yeah, and maybe speed also. You know, if you,
Might be the
yeah,
biggest one.
if you go with another plastic pipe, not PVC, but, you know, like an Aquatherm product or a CBVC, it would limit the hot work, and maybe you could get it done quicker, just without the welding and stuff that would go along with a metal pipe.
So what is the next step here?
Well, I had a couple more questions, actually. So these repairs started in what year, 2015?
The repairs to the geothermal started in October of last year.
I'm sorry, on the piping.
The piping started, I think, as far back as 2015, 2016. That was just prior to the lawsuit being initiated. We've only repaired a couple points where there were failures. Some of it was at joint, where the brittle tended to wear very differently around the joints.
So if these defects occurred in 2015, when did we come to a realization that the PVC was not going to work long-term?
That was 18, 19 during the construction defect lawsuit is when and Dave, you may have some more specificity on this, but it was during that lawsuit that the studies were brought forth that showed that PVC and glycol didn't mix, and glycol had an effect of turning it brittle. And then the additional thing was is that the way the pipes were hung and set, and the heat gain and loss during the building tended to expand and contract the pipe and cause more failure.
So the awareness that the PVC was faulty occurred in 2018, 2019. When did,
Yeah, 10 or 12 years after the building was open.
okay, thank you. So when did we come to a realization of what this 4.5 to 5 million of replacement costs was going to be? When did we know with any certainty that that was the estimated cost to replace the PVC?
So in April of 19, as a part of the lawsuit process, now understand, we weren't involved at that time, so we're piecing the history together. Tolan Mechanical, Dave's firm, put together a report for the expert witness team as part of that lawsuit. And at that time, it was identified to be roughly 4.4 million. There was some back and forth between the experts for the district as the plaintiff and the defense team, some negotiation of scope. Ultimately, it was arrived at 4.5 million in April of 19 as the estimated replacement cost, both for the geothermal well field as well as the interior PVC piping and various pumps, control upgrades, sequence of operation elements, things of that nature. That includes all the pipe, taking down ceilings, replacing ceilings, hard lid ceilings, which would be sheetrock, paint and patch, all the associated sort of sundry components.
So just to reiterate, you started with 4.5 million in 2019. That's what you just described. In detail, in 2019, it was 4.5 million estimate to do the entire project, which included the PVC.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward here a little bit, because when did we know that it was going to be 4.5 to 5 million just to replace PVC? Because I think that's what I'm hearing you say today, is we've spent
correct.
2 million on fixing this, I'll call it the geothermal system, the generator, or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
And we spent 2 million to get that repaired or replaced. Was it replaced?
Yep, it's a complete replacement.
Okay,
field.
okay. And now you're saying that the 4.5 estimate from 2019 is now 6.5 to 7 million, given today's
Yep.
estimate.
Basically escalation.
And the question I'm trying to get from you is, when did you know that the replacement of the PVC was going to be 4.5 to 5 million? Because that's what I'm understanding to be the remaining cost and the remaining work.
Right. So our current engagement was isolated to the geothermal well field. And so as that project is wrapping up, Bob asked us to kind of support him and the district in figuring out the next steps, which would be getting to the inside, piping replacement, and ask us to develop an opinion of probable cost for that work. So just within the last couple weeks, we've done an inventory of what that scope would include, applied some escalation based on what the general market conditions have been over the last 2 years, and arrived at that new estimated cost. It is what I would call a fat pencil, big rock. It's not a finite, itemized, hard bid from a contractor. So I think as we get into the steps of recommendation, I think it would be to, create a project to investigate in greater detail how that cost would be determined. Rely on Tolan or other contractors to help us itemize a more definitive scope and be able to narrow that gap. But it all depends on the timing of when that work might take place and the phasing of what that work will do. So I think our hope is to just create a greater awareness within the context of the district to prepare financially. And then we, through a process of, sort of push and pull, we'll arrive at the right combination of time and budget to implement the next phase. So in an ideal situation, if you were able to, tomorrow say, we're gonna commit another 4.5 million, let's go, then we develop a strategy to do that. If we say, hey, we've got $2.5 million, how far can we get? Then we would prioritize that workload, develop a scope of work to account for that, and develop the strategy to implement that. It would require us either to work with Tolan, who is the current prime contractor for the geothermal replacement, or go out to the market and go through an additional bid process.
Who did the repairs over time? Did your firm?
No, we never were involved
I
with
think
any of the
that
repairs.
The district has handled most of the
Yeah, the
repairs
district
that
has
have been
handled-
in place.
Our own maintenance folks?
Our own maintenance folks and you.
And what?
You plumbing has come in a couple times to replace joints, things that we couldn't weld, things that we're not prepared to do. We have a journeyman plumber on tax, but all of that requires a master.
Okay, so a broad brush estimate here of 4.5 to 5. Ron, I'm going to speak for you, but you can feel free to chime in, because I recall Ron asking the question before we approved this final geothermal replacement of, well, essentially opportunity cost, right? So, something to the effect that, well, is it worth spending the $2 million, or should we switch back to boilers or traditional heating, cooling systems? Ron, I don't want to speak for you, but I remember you asking that question. Do you want to clarify that at all?
Yeah, ironically, I was just penning exactly that to Ms. Phillips, because you were engaged in the conversation to ask on my behalf, because a little of the audio may not be the case for Matt. From the presenter side, it's tough. You're from the board panel side, seems to be fine. But yeah, so the short answer to your question is yes. But here's the summary I would like us to at least think about, is since the system has been put in place and turned on, which I believe was August 2008, through today, we have roughly 13, 14 years of history, do we not?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. What's the sum total of the energy savings our taxpayers have enjoyed over that time?
So the difference between what it's actually cost us with this system versus traditional boilers, et cetera, right? The alternative.
Yeah, we aren't prepared to respond to that. We don't have the history or the background, but I can imagine that could be modeled.
Yeah, and I'm just going to reinforce Ron's question because I think it's germane to what our future decision is here, right? Is what's the difference, right, between these costs of these systems in operating, ongoing month to month, year to year operating costs? Is there a savings? And if there is, we need to factor that into any kind of decision moving forward. Right, Ron?
And then the supplement to it, in the spirit of moving forward, is given what we've experienced in the last 5 or 6 years, what is a conservative estimate for the sum total of the CapEx and the OpEx expense for the district's taxpayers for the next 2 decades to run the system and keep it in proper working order?
Very clear to me. Did you guys pick that up? But essentially, historically, what's the savings? Prospectively, going forward, what's the difference as well? But it's two differences, right? The going forward is it 4.5 or whatever the fine number ends up being? And then what's the difference in operating costs, traditional wise versus this? And see, over time, 2 decades is what I heard Ron suggest. That will help inform us, big picture, broad brush. Is this the right direction? Ron, did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, we could, if we're saving $4 million a year, that helps us fund other priorities and initiatives. Conversely, if ultimately, given the life cycle of the components that could potentially wear out or break, and whatever the ongoing expenses are just to keep it up and running, if that's more than the traditional model, then as much as being green is wonderful and valuable, it may not make common sense for the operations of the district. We just want to understand the animal so we can make a quality decision on behalf of the taxpayers, students, and the staff.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think I completely understand that line of questioning. I would caution the board with respect to the commitment has been made to replace the geothermal field. That in essence replaces a boiler or a chiller or a boiler and a cooling tower. It's your heating and cooling source. If you were to abandon the geothermal field, for example, you've got boilers that will handle part of that load. You'd have to add a chiller or a cooling source. But we've sort of got that part of the project done. At this point, the heat pumps in the building that are served by the geothermal require on this failing distribution pipe to operate. So you really don't really have an opportunity to forego replacing that pipe.
And
right?
we appreciate that very much, in fact. But I think the key that I'm hearing from Ron that I agree with is that we need to look at the big picture. And that caution that you just brought up should be a part of this picture, right? And the question for me and the rest of the board, I believe, is where do we go from here? And that's where Teresa was before I interrupted her, of where do we go from here now? And I think Ron's points I totally agree with. What's the value factor of geothermal versus traditional historically? What would it be prospectively? And then what are the costs of these alternatives with all the cautions and red flags and everything you want to share with us? And what does that all cost and how long would it take to really put that in place so that we could actually have an informed decision?
Yeah, I think it's just having the context within the biggest picture we can. Because over the years, at least since I've been on the board, we've gotten pieces and failures and repairs and whatnot. But I think, especially for our community, given the cost associated with this, we need to pull back just a little bit, get a little bit bigger elevation picture, and then come in with the solution, final solution and get it done, so that it's not hanging over our heads anymore.
Yeah, during the I guess design phase for the geothermal well field replacement, we ran some scenarios with the help of our engineering team and Tolan to look at alternatives. So at that point, there was an opportunity to augment the existing boiler system and then add a cooling tower or a chiller and abandon the well field entirely. So through that analysis, it was identified that there could be some savings in respect to, say, our current $2 million project. But the direction that we received as a project team was to stay the course with geothermal, that the priority was to maintain that as a system. The district had made that commitment years earlier, and the overall cost payback was anticipated to be the right move. And so, again, we did that during that analysis of options in an effort to try to find a value-oriented replacement for the geothermal.
This was in
well field.
2019?
This was in 2021.
2021.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we could get a sort of a schematic of the timeline as well when we get a bigger picture, so that might be helpful.
So I just wanted to weigh in from the standpoint that when we discussed this back last spring, the scope that John just iterated was not necessarily laid out in its full detail as we are talking right now, but I think the essence of it at that time was we believe that moving forward with the replacement of the field was the best course of action. What I don't think we had is the information that we're working with now, which is that we were looking at the full replacement of all PVC pipe to the tune of what this current cost is. So I think that's what's troubling for all of us, is that it feels like we were working with not as much information as what we have in front of us today.
And having said that, I think it's even more incumbent on us to really look at the big picture with that detail, so that maybe it was the right decision. I'm not going to say, I don't know, to be frank.
Sure.
But what's the right decision today is what I'm really trying to get to.
That makes perfect sense to me. I think that, for the board and for district administration, I want to clarify that the difference in cost from April of 19 to what we've speculated as an additional investment on the district's behalf is tied pretty exclusively to market escalation. It's not as if the scope of work has changed significantly or that there's a change in the philosophy to replace that piping. It really is as a result of the drastic increase in market price, escalation, labor, all the factors that have gone into that. So, we're seeing it. I'm sure you're seeing it on other projects that we're not touching. We're seeing it across the board in our market where, 15, 18, 20% cost difference in projects that were budgeted in late 19 and 20 that are being executed in 21 and 22 as a result of that market.
Which I understand that. And so really what you're saying to me is I'm hearing that the analysis we're asking for isn't going to be that difficult because you've done most of the groundwork already. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. So what we're asking for in terms of laying out the detailed plan, you may not, it was broad brush, I hear you, right?
Sure.
So it's going to take a little effort to fine tune it. And what are the alternatives to steel pipe, and what's the risk with those new materials, et cetera, right? Those things still need some fleshing out to be done. But you're just reinforcing our request, I believe, by everything you're saying is, we've done some of that. You've done different parts of it. It's inflation that's causing us the issue. All of those things, that's good to me because that means we're probably not that far away from actually getting the detailed overview, and so we can actually make what I would call an informed decision. Being made aware versus having to make a decision are two different things. Because
Yep.
we have teachers' pay, right, that's impacted by all of this expenditure, because this isn't, we don't have the funds, right? It comes out of our operating budget, essentially. So it's not like we have the money. So we need to really understand to some level of certainty what it's going to be. And if you need to put inflation factors in there because it's a 3-year or 2-year job, then we need to know that. And I still agree with what Ron's request was, is big picture, there, at some point, sunk costs are sunk costs, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
At some point. Now, you may come back and say, here's what it is, and here's your 2 decades outlook, and we're all going to say, yeah, we agree with that. But we need to see it. So I totally support what Ron's question and request is, and I totally support what Teresa's saying, is we really need to have it in a timeline that we feel comfortable in saying, yeah, we're going to commit to something.
Yep.
Now, that something, I don't know what it is, because I haven't heard you even suggest what it is. It could be a 2-summer or 3-summer project. I don't know. That's sort of dependent on the next step we're asking for.
Yeah, there's a chicken or the egg, cart before the horse issue of phasing and budget and opportunity cost and escalation.
Yeah.
Right now, based on what we've seen over the last couple of years, I think the tendency would be to perhaps overinflate from an escalation standpoint, what costs might be in a coming year versus the, present value.
We support that approach.
Yeah, right. And so I've tried to do that with that fat pencil, to say it's $4.5 to $5 million of additional scope to execute that work. But it's one of those things where we're going to have to work with administration and, find the sweet spot ultimately
Understood.
before we can fine tune a recommendation.
Matt, do you have any comments or questions on this issue?
I don't. I think Ron kind of framed many of the questions and concerns that I have as well.
Excellent. Ron, anything further?
Yeah, and thank you all for walking through this. Do we know what the payback was on the original investment?
I'm sure that data is out there. We haven't run those calculations.
We can pull it
So,
together, though.
Yeah, I mean, we can,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
somebody
very
can.
well. Was that a yes or a no?
Well, it's not at the table here today, but they will pull it together as part of your earlier request of, what the difference between traditional and geothermal would be, and then the actual that whatever that savings would be. Is that what you're asking for?
No. Well, maybe. I'm having trouble hearing the presenters. Here's what I'm trying to get to. At some juncture, someone engaged in District 38 made a decision when Palmer Ridge was being built to go with geothermal versus traditional. What was that investment, and what was the payback? In other words, was it 6 months, 600 months, 60 months?
Yeah, so
What I'm trying
let
to
me
get to is what was
reiterate
the
that
original
for you, Ron.
expectation and what was reality?
Yeah, so Ron, I think what I'm hearing Ron say is the original design of the building, there had to have been a choice. Why did they choose geothermal versus traditional? And what was the expected payback originally? And that's what I think Ron's asking for. Correct, Ron?
Yeah, but here, let me explain the rationale behind the question.
Totally get it.
No,
Some people
they're
could
saying
look at
they
that.
understand.
Yeah, some people could look at this and say, it's all water on the bridge. What does it matter? Here's what it matters. It's relatively new technology. And I think it was the largest geothermal implementation in the entire state at that juncture. When it's new technology, you have a lot of unknowns. And the trick is, after 10 years, it's a nice way to go back and say, so how much of this is now mature or still not mature? And if we're going to make a significant investment going forward, and we found that it's still not very mature, then we need to leave a lot of cushion in our estimates.
They're nodding in agreement, Ron.
Yeah, so Ron, I don't know if you can hear me better now. I'm trying to speak more directly into the microphone. This is
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is John Sattler with DCS. So, it is normal within the sort of analysis of a project to do that cost payback study on the front end, employing energy models and energy costs and some escalation in energy cost to come to that decision of which system to use. Not having any frame of reference, I would suggest that there was probably a 10-year or less cost payback that was identified and that supported that decision. But we've seen other clients and other districts, from the standpoint of making a green statement, make a decision to go with geothermal in lieu of conventional systems. So we can support the effort with Bob Foster to come to at least some form of record review and extraction to see if we can discern how that decision was made. And then from that, we can analyze, based on energy costs and analysis of those energy bills, how that played out over time. I think it will be general and broad brush, and there's there's some science to it and there's some alchemy to kind of sorting that out. But I think we can, and when I say we, our team and others support the development of that information and data to backfill the void or the gap in knowledge and information that you all currently have.
Thank you. Tiffany, any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a couple. So, as we're going through this, things that are popping up into my mind is exactly what Ron said, so I can just, he's already asked the questions I was going to ask, I checked them off. Are there any other similar models in Colorado or across the nation where either A, we're seeing the same type of circumstance, or B, we're seeing success?
There are, I'm gonna speculate here because I'm not a geothermal expert, but there are dozens of geothermal well field installations in our state that are successful, that don't have failure. Our firm has had the experience to work on a project in San Luis Valley that had a failed geothermal well field due to poor installation, poor quality control during the installation, as well as design errors that led to internal piping problems, not pipe material failures, but just bad engineering that prevented that school from being properly heated. And our firm came in after the lawsuit and managed the repair work. So we know of two, let's just call it failures of geothermal installations compared to, dozens to probably hundreds. Our firm's been involved with, I think, the installation of 4 or 5 geothermal well field projects, as owner's rep, providing oversight and management, that have all been successful and that have not had any of the problems that Palmer Ridge High School has experienced. So I think that there's, while it's relatively new, there's been a lot of advancement in the sort of the knowledge of industry that has limited those kind of failures. I think you all in Palmer Ridge High School was sort of on what I'd call the bleeding edge of implementation of geothermal. We refer to technology in that way sometimes. It's painful to be a pioneer, and I think perhaps without knowing it, the district was a pioneer at the time that this field was designed and this system was engineered and implemented.
Isn't this building geothermal too? I mean, you guys have successful, yeah. So I mean, Tolan specializes in existing buildings. In just a second, what John said, we don't see a disproportionate number of failed geothermal systems to traditional systems. Like, I think there's construction defects and things that happen in initial construction that just go bad sometimes. I wouldn't say that it happens more common on geothermal projects more than VRF or, traditional HVAC for what that's worth, so.
And then my second question is probably more geared to you, Mr. Foster. Within the building, as we're going through all this, from the minute those doors open to even here as we sit here today, what is the feedback from the staff and the students that are in the building as far as their comfort level with cooling and heating?
I think, as you remember, you may recall, back in the '08 through probably 12, 13 timeframe, there were several times when a loss of cooling, or excuse me, or rather more a loss of heating, led to discomfort and an unpleasant atmosphere at times during the school. In fact, that was brought up during the period of the lawsuit that ended in the mediation. I can say that one of the issues that caused a delay in the mediation, or perhaps the lawsuit in general, and figuring that out, was a lot of finger pointing from the various subcontractors who installed the system as to whose problem it was we were chasing. And that was ultimately the problem with the final settlement, as to there was not one single source that you could point to that said that was bad. But the bad in that resulted in, yeah, it was a cold building at times. You may recall several complaints directed towards, I think even some of them back in 11, 12, when it was a very extremely cold winter, ended up with the Board of Education. They came to them and complained about the lack of heating in that building. The cooling was not what it should have been all along, but because the building is rather unoccupied during the summer, it's not as readily noticed. However, people noticed like a hot building in the spring. That was because the geothermal field wasn't working. The geothermal field, as it stands right now, the old field is at the point of failure, where more lines have continued to fail since we started drilling the new. Old lines have continued to fail. And it is at the point right now where that building is running. It's good that it's winter because it's got a boiler, but it does not have cooling right now. It does not have a cooling system, and won't have a cooling system until the new geothermal field comes online and is crossed over in the next month or so. So the time is good for that. You know, it's good that it happened during the winter, that we're doing this work during the winter, because it affords us the ability to back it up. But I think, as you remember, you probably wouldn't recall, I think it was in 09, 10, right in that time frame after the building was opened. I think it was open about 4 or 5 years, and I think it was at that point, at some point during that time frame, Cheryl had a boiler installed because of the heating. We didn't have a boiler in that building when it was first built, and they installed the boiler system in there because the heating was so erratic. That was one of the fixes that we sort of threw at it. We threw at it a boiler and put a boiler in there, and to back up the geothermal, because we couldn't maintain that. That said, as far as the effectiveness of geothermal, I think Moby Arena up at CSU is now all geothermal. So it's effective.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, one second, please, Ron. Teresa, did you have any more questions or comments on this? Ron, go ahead.
Thanks. And again, apologies if this has already been covered and I just couldn't hear it. When that incremental unplanned for boiler was installed in Palmer Ridge,
Right.
which, by the way, is a wonderful insurance policy to have, how much did it cost the district and the taxpayers?
Good question, Ron. I would not know that right offhand. My guess would.
Not a problem. Can you please include that in the analysis?
Yes. Just bring it forth in the
This
analysis.
is how much we've spent up till now.
And
This is how much we've saved up till now.
And some of that analysis, Ron, I can pull from, perhaps I can find documentation. In the lawsuit, we did deal with documentation of how much we had spent on work and how much we had spent, and some of those were loose, rough costs, because we were not clear in that early time frame why we were dealing with pipe failures on a new building. It wasn't.
But the information's available.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
We have some of that information available. That said, the other aspect to this about re-engineering the building to accept a chilling tower and those things. That building was predicated on the current, it was so designed on the current system that adding chilling towers and adding that was, at the time when we were evaluating whether you just fill the geothermal system full of full of slurry and you close it, the cost of adding that far exceeded the cost of fixing it.
Thank you, Bob.
Yep.
Tiffany, I had interrupted you. Were you finished?
So the reason I was asking that question was, as we're going through and looking at with the question that Ron brought up, which is a good one, of the cost effectiveness, there's also a piece of that is a comfort level of the building. So let's just say hypothetically we find out it's cheaper to put in chillers, but it's not effective in the building. So that's what I was getting at, is I wanted to know, is there a pro and con?
Yeah, excellent point. So I don't have any other questions. So what I'd like to do is turn a moment to Dr. Summers to see what he would recommend that the board consider now.
So we appreciate the opportunity to share this information, get questions, feedback, clarity in how we want to move forward. Obviously, we are not in a position to recommend a decision or a course of action today. What I would like to do, and I'm going to turn initially here to both John and Dave, is see if you would be available to come back by March 1st, which is our next work session, with a deeper analysis into what has been shared with us from the board, which I believe will be in a position, with Mr. Foster's help and more efforts from our end, to produce a next level analysis, is what I'll describe, with some different options and recommendations that we can be more detailed in, with an opportunity for the board at that time to have more information and lead us toward a path, lead us toward a decision. So we just want to make sure that we're not rushing that, but that we're not delaying it either. So if that suits both these gentlemen as well as our board, that would be where I'd like us to move forward at this point.
So I think we can work with Bob and the district team to provide some of the historical detail that we don't currently have, to help frame the picture. I think that we completely understand the nature of the questions and the desire to understand, what the capital expense has been, what the savings has resulted in, and really its analysis sort of in review of the effectiveness of the current system. I would just offer that the existing piping system and the potential for failures exists, right? And so what we've attempted to do today is to just elevate awareness to that, and I would recommend that, sort of separate of these other steps, that the district at least start to develop a strategy on how to communicate and mitigate loss and failure due to the piping. That is a reality we can't pinpoint, and so it's I might suggest there's sort of two parallel paths, right? There's this: establish a plan to be prepared for repairs or replacement, and then there's how do we get into this mess and what are our steps to get out of it. And I think that's sort of how I understand the nature of the questions and the thought process.
May I add one thing?
Absolutely.
Let's make sure that when we think about how we got in this mess, how we get out of it, that we consider how to avoid getting into it in the future.
Well, or how to optimize the next 20 years and what our expenses are in that equation.
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair. We don't come to you as proponents of geothermal. We come to you as proponents of the right solutions, and there's a lot of dynamics that go into that. We are involved with a lot of projects that, because of limitations of facility staff to operate a system like that we move away from recommendations to go with geothermal. So I just want to make it clear that we're not here as a proponent of geothermal. We're just executing the plan that had been established, and we're happy to support additional decision making by the board.
I think I'm safe in suggesting that the board appreciates and supports Dr. Summers' recommendation, that we'd like to have a review on March 1 of more of a detailed understanding and answer the questions that have been raised, et cetera, so that, as you recommended, we start that communication process more globally in our community, so everybody really does have a clearer understanding of what the situation is and what the alternatives are going forward. So thank you, Dr. Summers, and this was the best I've heard in terms of an update and an understanding of where we're at, even though it's broad brush.
Well, we appreciate that. I think we maybe have got into more than we had bargained for with respect to the historical perspective, but I think that, as it maybe bringing back to focus what we were prepared to speak to today, this geothermal field replacement is taking a little longer than we had hoped, but it's on track. When it is completed, the heating and cooling source for the building will be resolved. And I think that's how this entire problem at Palmer Ridge started, is that initially installed well field was, it failed, and it limited the building's ability to meet the heating loads. And so we'll have that part done and kind of checked off the list.
In 2007 or 8 or whenever the design went into place, they chose PVC. Well, that mistake is coming to bear now, right? And it's not like anything anyone here did. Bob, you were here, but you didn't make that choice, right?
Not as the teacher of the middle school. Sorry, assistant principal of the middle school.
Yeah, I think
All right.
that.
Nobody asked me.
All right, so thank you very much. So moving on, in priority 1,
Thank you.
Rick, I apologize, that 20 minutes went an hour. So I hope that you'll give us a full 15.
I'll be happy to. In the last meeting, I had to follow the portrait of the graduate, and that was a tough ask. This one might be a little easier.
Agreed.
Right? Let's talk about some kids. We've had the opportunity to dig a little deeper into the panorama survey. You'll see a PowerPoint that has some of the information on what we've learned as we've done our dive into this. Excuse me. Each of the principals have had an opportunity to really do a deep dive in their building. Some of our principals have put this in front of their building leadership teams, and a couple have even put it in front of their entire faculty for an opportunity to really take a deep dive into what our students are telling us. And we have some things that we really can celebrate and be happy about, and we also are setting some goals to move forward on how we can improve and make the learning experience for kids in our schools as beneficial as possible. If you go to the second page, there are 6 sections in the elementary survey that we put together. The wellness section was created by the principals for Lewis Palmer, and that's 4 questions that we devised, very specific to the social emotional curriculum that are in place, whether it be the responsive classroom or the capturing kids' hearts. So we were very specific to look to see how well we're implementing those and ask those questions in the wellness section for those pieces. We did not have the wellness section at the secondary, but we have the 5 other sections that are the same in both secondary and elementary. The questions were different based on the developmental stages of the students answering the questions, so they were slightly different, but they're getting to the same topics. If you go to the start at the elementary, you can see that the students who are providing responses that range from slightly engaged to very engaged would be 83%. I'm not going to read all of these. You can go through the 6 and see that we have strengths in student-teacher relationships, school climate, and the wellness piece is something, again, the principals wanted to focus on and will continue to do so. In the secondary, you can also see you can see some of the trends there. I can tell you that 56% engagement at the secondary level is much closer to the national norm. One of the advantages to having the panorama survey is we get to see how we compare to the national norm. And engagement at the secondary level is quite common and typical for to be a little bit lower at that age. There's a developmental piece to that. Nonetheless, it's something we need to focus on, continue to look at, and see what we can do to improve. And I know that the principals and the staffs in our buildings paid very close attention to some of those numbers, which are definitely lower than what we would hope for. Just so you can get a sense on what the questions are within each section, you can get a sense on what we're asking kids. And you can see why engagement, they talk about being excited and interested in the topics, school climate, talk about fair or unfair rules. There are multiple questions in each of these topics, but I grabbed a few just so you can get a sense of what we're asking. School safety, which I want to definitely highlight. School safety at the secondary level was 88% favorable, which was in the very, very top 1 or 2% across the country. So we can be very proud of how our kids are feeling safe in our schools, especially in our secondary schools. But you can get a sense on engagement, school climate, school safety. The next slide is sense of belonging, teacher-student relationships, and then the wellness questions for elementary. Any questions on the topics or the questions before we go into the goal setting?
I'm curious about the portrait of a graduate work that was done and how it aligns with this, if it does.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And Amber, maybe you can help me, but I remember us talking just the other night about how the social emotional components of a student and the nature in which students are engaging with school and engaging with the content is very much what we would expect a portrait of a graduate to look like. This is a big part of it. And if our students aren't feeling a sense of belonging and they're not having relationships with teachers, any of the work we're doing, whether it be academic in nature or otherwise, is not going to be as effective.
Is the survey process a form of monitoring our success of the portrait of a graduate?
I think we can create a crosswalk to connect the two. It isn't devised specifically and only for that, but we could absolutely create a crosswalk because there's so much overlay between the two. I don't think that would be much effort at all. One of the things we're going to talk about at the very end is we're going to re-administer this test so we can measure growth and we can take a look at improvement. We're going to be focusing on some areas that the principals feel are very important. And I do think we'll see a lot of connections between the two, and that will not be much of an effort.
Okay, I was going to say I agree with everything you said. And as we continue to develop those I can statements that we talked about at the last meeting, that's a great way for us to align this work.
And I appreciate the crosswalk concept because, the ongoing life, if you will, of a portrait of a graduate is only, strengthened with the ability to show growth. So I think that's excellent.
Yep.
One thing I noticed that I was curious more about is the teacher-student relationship between the elementary is the 87%. That's awesome. But then we go down to a 66% teacher-student relationship at the secondary. And I don't know if we're able to pinpoint or figure out where that's coming from or how to improve on that.
Again, when we look at the national data, that's a great question, by the way. When we look at the national data, developmentally, it's a more natural decline. So some of that's just going to happen because of the age and the place kids are at and the way that they perceive the relationships with teachers and adults in general. So, but that's not an excuse. I think our principals are paying very close attention to the question I'm hearing a lot of them ask is what's happening to the other 33% or the other 34%? Those are the ones we need to pinpoint and worry about because we want every child to feel like they have a good relationship with the teacher. So despite the fact that it's following a trend that we would expect in the secondary level where kids are less natural to gravitate towards adults, just where they're at in life, we still care very deeply about the 34% who aren't giving us the feedback that we want to see. And that is the million-dollar question is what are we doing about that and how can we improve that?
But part of that is in elementary, you usually have one teacher all day, and the relationship is stronger, deeper. Then you move into secondary and you got 5 or 8 different teachers. And so you don't have as much time, et cetera. So there's some natural evolution of the education process that impacts this question as well.
Yep, and I think the national trends would support multiple reasons for that decline. But.
And to that point, where can we see the national data?
We absolutely can provide that information for you. It's not part of today's presentation, though.
Okay, it'd be helpful in the future.
Great request. Do we have it by state as well? Just out of curiosity. So it's national and local.
Yep. It is broken down by urban and non-urban school districts and size of school districts in the
Well,
league.
I'm interested in those sort of comparisons, if that supports your thoughts.
And that's one of the reasons we went with Panorama. That's the strength of the tool that we're using.
Sure, and then more specifically, and perhaps not as aligned with the portrait of a graduate line of questioning, but given the last 2 years in the pandemic, is Panorama doing any, are there some results that could indicate to us how we're doing with engagement and social emotional wellness at that level?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's my understanding that the questions that we're using were normed pre-pandemic, so that's got to be a factor that we need to consider is how has the pandemic influenced the students' responses in each of these topics. And I can work very closely with them. We've got a good representative who would be willing to help us. So that's a question that I can inquire
Well,
about.
to Teresa's point, there's probably some trends in Panorama itself based on their database of questions. Maybe that would point out things that we should be watching for because we don't have the history, but there is a national history here that maybe there's trends that would be meaningful.
Sure, and it's just a current conversation, and anecdotally, there seem to be a lot of young people struggling at times.
Yes.
Year and a half.
Yep.
I would also be curious too to see, I imagine, to your point, Teresa, that there's also a tie-in between one category to another. For example, going back to teacher-student relationship, I look at, like you said, the sense of belonging. Anecdotally, we always told our kids, find one teacher at least, or one adult in the building who's your go-to person. And if you have one person that each day makes you smile or checks on you, that helps in that sense of belonging. So that's just an example of, I'd be curious to, would be curious to see the national trend too, because I'm curious also if it shows how each of these can relate to the other.
Matt, any questions or comments?
No.
Ron, any questions or comments?
Also, no, thank you, though.
Teresa, any further?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Tiffany? Rick, thank you very much.
Certainly, certainly.
So moving on, the next part of priority 1 is instructional technology updates / student safety.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to provide you an update on our instructional technology processes. I'm going to invite some team members up to the table with me. We have Suzanne McGarrico and Michelle Jewell, our instructional technology coaches, as well as Mr. Chris Mack, our technology manager. And I'm going to just introduce the topic. This presentation came out of a request from the board to take a look at how we are protecting students with the use of technology. And so we hope to provide you a little bit of information and then answer questions that you may have. as I looked at relevant policies related to this topic, you'll see those listed here. We do have policies that address both students and staff use of technology in the district, and these policies were added to our policy matrix. I'm not sure if the one that's included in board docs has these included, but they are updated now as reviewed and no recommendations for changes at this time. So we're going to talk about some of the tools and processes we use to keep students safe. However, as you see here, the internet is not intended to be a safe place, but we do have some processes in place that help it be a little bit safer for students when they're accessing our network as well as our devices. I'm going to hand it over to Chris to tell you a little bit more about that.
Okay. I don't know if I should hold this or try not to. So as Amber mentioned, internet is not a safe place. It's not intended to be a safe place. We can't make it safe. We can make it safer. We do this in a variety of ways. We do it in three main ways. The first way being all internet traffic is monitored. That is content filtering. It looks at the content of the page or the resource that the user is trying to access. This happens at the staff level. It happens at the student level. All internet traffic is filtered, and then we can apply graduated policies based on who is accessing the internet. We also utilize a product called Gaggle, which is student, the technology is so new, there's not really a name for the type of product. This student data monitoring is a name that I gave it. It monitors pretty much everything that the students are doing inside of the Google environment. So for example, if a student were to upload a pornographic photo to Google, the Gaggle service will catch it immediately, quarantine the file so that the student can no longer access it, and more importantly, can no longer share it, and then alert us to the issue so that we could deal with it. And then we also use device monitoring software, which is a product called Land School, made by a company called Stoneware, which allows a teacher in a classroom to monitor what the students are doing on the machines. They can literally see in real time what the students are doing. So as I mentioned, everything passes through a content filter, which blocks internet content based on settings we define. The content is generally falls into a category basis. So most internet content filters do not have the ability to see what you're looking at on the page. They don't know what the photo is that you're looking at. They function based off of a reputation category. So the good people at Lightspeed are constantly adding and removing and changing websites in certain categories, and then we can block or allow those categories for the user groups that we define. We can do this for everything from pornography to hate speech to drugs, gambling, websites in foreign languages, websites from countries with bad reputations, et cetera, et cetera.
Who has control of this, what's being filtered? Is it Lightspeed or is it District 38?
D38.
So
yeah.
you have control of what the filters are.
Right. For example, if a website, xyz.com, was filtered as something educational, and as a result, the educational category was allowed for a group of students, and we were getting complaints that XYZ had non-educational content, and the teachers or the principal in the building didn't like it anymore, we can recategorize that website into something that would be blocked.
So don't take this the wrong way, but I, for the last year or so, come into this building and I try and go to the El Paso County Health org to look at their vaccine dashboard, and inside this internet or intranet, it's blocked. The content isn't available. When I'm at home, my own internet or access, I can see all of this. This is an example of the filtering that occurs, right?
Correct.
And why this is filtered, I don't know. I don't know that I care too much, but the point is I've seen it as a board member when I come in and sit in this building and try and access a particular website, and it just comes up and says the content isn't available. but yet I know it is, right? So
Right.
it's being filtered by light speed.
Right. And you'll see in that second paragraph there that the Lightspeed filter in the industry, it's known for being relatively block heavy. The way that they happen to categorize websites tends to be a little bit block heavy. It's a regular task in my department that we need to recategorize things to make them allowed. You are probably receiving a block because you're on the guest network, which has a much tighter filtering profile. We could always make adjustments to it, but it's pretty tight filter.
I was just using it as an example. I didn't want any action. But it helps me appreciate what you're describing.
So the next thing that we'll talk about is Gaggle. So Gaggle is a relatively new technology that we're utilizing. We've had it for, I think, about 3 years now. As I said, it monitors everything that is happening inside of the Google environment for students. This filter is not applied to staff, only applied to students. And in general, it is looking for 3 things. It's looking for bad language. It's looking for what they refer to as questionable content, which is photos, links to websites, video files, and then it's also looking for what they consider the most severe issue, a possible student situation, which is a credible threat towards student safety, building safety, or pornography when it is expected to be of a student. And there's a variety of different ways that Gaggle will notify us in the event that it detects something like this. But as I previously mentioned, it's pretty amazing at quarantining off the files and isolating them so that no one will ever have access to it. We have an internal process that's pretty much the same at each building when we are alerted to something like this. Sometimes district safety gets involved when it's a credible threat, or a wellness check or a welfare check is recommended or something along those lines.
Question.
But yeah.
So I received a phone call from an admin at the school building because a word was used in an email of my student, and it raised the flag, and I thought appropriately so. So I'm not complaining again. It happens, and I like it. So the question it raises is, do you track metrics here, or is there some sort of, metrics that we might want to share? I don't know that we want to share all of this, but I'm just looking for what does this mean, right? You're tracking, you have filtering, but what does that mean? What does it mean to you? And then is it something we should share or not share, or?
I don't know that I have an answer to every one of those questions, but definitely the first half of it. Can we pull the statistics and the metrics? We absolutely can. We can pull them on a building level. We can look at the breakdown of the types of alerts that each building is receiving, the severity of them, the percentage of alerts throughout the year, and so on and so forth. This particular service does generate a fair amount of false positives, especially when students are doing reports on things like Romeo and Juliet, where there's a lot of suicide references and stuff like that. But everything is taken seriously at the building level, and the administrators go through everything as if it were credible.
And I'll just jump in. I know that in an upcoming presentation on Priority 1, I believe Mr. Frampton and Mr. Coates are going to be providing an update on our safety processes, and we can certainly provide you some of those metrics as far as what we're seeing in Gaggle at that time.
Sneak peek of the February 22nd meeting.
Any other questions on Gaggle or Lightspeed? As far as internet content filtering and watching student data, these are the 2 primary things that we're utilizing.
I have 2 questions. Go ahead. So does this apply when you're monitoring it? Is it monitored on both district devices, if I understand, district devices and individually owned devices? Does that include cell phones?
If a cell phone connects to the district guest network, Lightspeed will filter the traffic. As far as Gaggle goes, The Google environment is 100% in the cloud, so it doesn't matter what device you're using, the data is monitored.
Teresa?
As far as, these are the two that cover student activity, how much of your department's time or energy or investment is used monitoring these?
We function more on an alert basis. I don't have somebody sitting at a computer monitoring everything that's happening on the internet at any one given time. We do jump in there and make adjustments to how things are being filtered and the configuration of the Lightspeed filter on a regular basis. As far as how much time, I mean, I'd say it's probably 20% of one person's time in general with dealing with Lightspeed. Gaggle is a little bit more of a set it and forget it. We only really take action when there's an alert. When there's an alert, we deal with it at that particular moment in time. I would say each alert takes anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours to deal with.
And then, second question, knowing everything you know about technology and then having these two processes in place, is there anything else that you wish you had as a tool to protect our kids?
It's a great question. I don't know if there's anything else I wish I had. I'd say as far as protecting the students inside of Gaggle, Gaggle's a wonderful, wonderful tool for that. I don't love the Lightspeed content filter. I think there are times when I might want to adjust that filter, maybe go with a different product from time to time. There's some new technology coming out that uses artificial intelligence to see exactly what it is on the page, so it solves the problem that I brought up earlier where Lightspeed doesn't know what the image is. It functions off of a reputation and a category basis. So the ability to move to perhaps a filter that is more expensive in the future is something I would like to at least consider, but as far as having a tool that I don't have now, I don't think there is one, no.
Okay, just follow-up question. Are these filters on subscription or is it?
They're both a yearly renewal.
Okay, year by year. Okay.
Matt, any questions or comments here? Or Ron?
Just a foundational question, and if it came up and I didn't hear it again, my apologies. For both Gaggle and Lightspeed, do they use signature or behavioral-based technology?
Gaggle's 100% behavioral, and I think Lightspeed is a combination of the both.
Okay. On the signature side, how often are, you said, is it Lightspeed that does both or Gaggle? I'm sorry.
Lightspeed, Ron.
But so for Lightspeed, then how often do they do updates on the signature profiles?
It's every single day they're making changes to category assignments and signature profiles and the like.
Fantastic. Good. Great. Thank you.
I had one question. So we try and screen in our home as well to protect our children. And this concept I'm going to use, you might have to help me understand it better yourself. But, you know, the concept of getting someplace through the back door. So I'm going to describe it, and then you might be able to clarify what I'm saying. So they can get into an app that's okay, but through the app, they can then access something. And I've heard that described as getting into a bad place through the back door that our filter doesn't catch because it's okay to go to the app, but then through the app, they can go someplace. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
It does. So generally when you refer to the backdoor access on a particular application or a tool, the front door would be the login page that everyone else sees. The back door would be a method to access the resource using an authentication method that's not available to everybody else or that is at least hidden and has to be uncovered. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. Generally, the situation you're describing is something similar to what's known as an internet proxy. An internet proxy functions by you are trying to access a resource. Let's again use xyz.com. XYZ is blocked in the district, but you can get to a proxy known as hideme.com. Hideme.com then goes to xyz.com on your behalf. So as long as you could get to the app, as you mentioned, or to xyz.com, you'd be able to access the resource that would otherwise be blocked. We solve that problem by simply blocking the app. We would block the proxy website, or we would block usage of the app inside the district so that you can't get to hideme.com, therefore you can't use the tool. It's an ever-evolving fight to block those things. Lightspeed's pretty good at blocking those particular tools, but nothing is perfect. If a student keeps trying and keeps trying and keeps hacking away at it, they might find a tool. Generally speaking, though, the minute that they find it, Lightspeed is then aware of it, and Lightspeed will recategorize the site.
Do these students get A's in IT for being so creative?
One of the most challenging students that we had, I think it was this year, I was told he does, yeah.
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 No, so you've answered my question, I think, and that is your tools address it, maybe not perfectly, but there is awareness, if you will, and the filtering for those scenarios.
Correct.
Very good.
Okay, move on.
Please.
I don't know if this mic really has worked. Is it?
It might.
Might not be. You want to just take that just now?
Sorry, I shut it off.
So you turn it back on.
I didn't.
Okay. So we've been talking kind of macro district level, and those are where the heavy tools really are. But we also have something within the classroom that teachers can control, and that's what we use called Land School. Land School has two products that we use, Land School Air, which is meant specifically for Chromebooks, and Land School Classic, which is more of a lab sort of environment. And what that does is it allows teachers to really be able to limit even more. So if you have a class full of students like you right now in front of computers, in order to control a little bit more what's going on, this teacher could blank your screen. And it could even have a little message on it saying, eyes up front, or need your attention, or let's take a break. And at that point, the teacher has control over what they are seeing on their computer. We can also have the teacher can push a website to everybody at once. Sometimes that's a real time saver. If you just want everybody to get to the same place at the same time, from my computer, I'd be able to push that out to all of you all at the same time. We can message students directly, and then of course we can take screenshots. Even when a teacher is seeing something, they'll be able to monitor everybody in the room at a quick glance just from their computer. So what I'm showing up there is basically just a small version of a screenshot of what a teacher's computer could look like in Land School Air, for example, where they would see a little box for every student in the classroom, and at a quick glance they can tell who's on what. And then if they want to drill in deeper, they can. They can look at that in a different way and be able to actually see what other tabs are open on that student's computer, because students are so good at quickly shifting between things. And when you're walking around, which is, of course, also what teachers should be doing, is proximity is one of the best ways to make sure students are staying on task. But when you're not right next to a student, you also want to know what's going on. So this tool has been very useful. We've rolled it out to all of our buildings. The Land School Air part of it is new to us this year, and it's being very well received by the teachers. Any questions on Land School? Yep.
How much training does this take, and when do you do it?
Right. Training is honestly about 10 minutes. We rolled it out last week when we had a full day. I went to Prairie Winds, and they gave me 20 minutes, and I didn't really even need all of that time. It's very quick. So, anything else?
Teresa just asked my question.
Matt or Ron, any questions? Thank you. Let's move on.
No, thanks.
The last thing we're going to talk about is digital citizenship, because we have all of these filters in place for students, but we also want to make sure that students are educated and understand their role in digital technology and their role in being, I think, safe not only on the internet, but making good decisions as far as passwords, good decisions in terms of apps, and good decisions for their social media presence. So what we've adopted as a district are K-12 lessons through digital, through Common Sense Media. And those are taught either through a technology rotation, through organic conversations that happen with teachers as they're doing a specific project or a specific assignment, so that they can have those conversations in real time, so they're authentic. But that's the tool that we're utilizing right now.
This is a proactive sense.
It is.
Yeah, I like it.
It is.
We're happy to answer any additional questions that you may have.
Yeah, Tiffany, go ahead.
So if you have a parent that's just not ready for their K-6 student to have an email account or be on digital or have access to any screen at all in the school district, we still have other policies in place, then those apply, that says if, it may be difficult for that student, but if you don't want your kid to look at a screen, they don't technically have to.
That's correct. Parents have the option to opt out, and then we provide an alternative activity for those students.
Is technology education part of a Colorado standard, or is that just something that we want to make sure that we are building good digital citizens?
I can bring more detailed information about that at a future meeting, but and maybe when Pam joins us, she can speak to this as well. But my understanding is that currently the Colorado Department of Education is reviewing and revising technology standards. There's been some shifts over time where they've been standalone versus integrated, but I'm happy to provide that information as a follow-up. I would need to do a little more research.
Well, Amber, while you're there, so didn't we just change our graduation requirements in this regard?
Absolutely,
Right.
yes, because again, this is really integrated throughout the time a student enters our system. They're learning these skills, and we expect that they are proficient by the time they graduate, as well as all of these skills being incorporated into our portrait of a graduate.
Teresa, anything?
No, nothing else. Thank you.
Ron?
No, thanks.
Matt?
No.
Excellent. So I'm just going to, I had a comment. First, thank you. Thank you very much. I deal in addiction recovery with adults, and pornography is one of those areas that is an addiction. And in fact, there's science that says it's as addictive as heroin. And without exception, anyone I've ever helped through the process of trying to heal, they start when they're teenagers. Without exception. That's why this is so important to me, not just for my children, but for all of our children. You know, it's addictive. It isn't something that is fun, exciting, or whatever else we want to describe it. It's addictive. So to me, I raised the issue, I push the issue, and I'm doing it intentionally because, you know, just like, do we have a graduate requirement of service? Because in my mind, and we have certain groups in high school or wherever that are service oriented, but do we actually have a requirement for service? Because just as I want to protect children from addiction or addictive type things, I also want to give them the ability to grow outwardly in serving others. Now, I don't know the answer to my question, and I'm not asking that as a question, as rhetorical. The point being is, it's the whole child, right? It's this social, emotional learning. And it's important that we protect our children, all of them. And so that's the reason I raise this. To me, it's as crucial as learning math, is to protect them from the potential negative consequences of things that exist on this unsafe internet. So thank you very much for everything you're doing this presentation and your focus. Thank you very much. All right. Priority 2, provide a world-class education for all students. I believe this is Amber and Pam.
Yes, I'll invite Ms. Pam Kern up to the table with me, our Learning Services Coordinator. Part of this presentation also addresses some recent board questions about how we adopt new curriculum in the district, but it also suffices for our obligation to present any new curriculum resources to the board for approval. So I'm going to start off, and then I'm going to have Pam just kind of jump in and help me clarify information. Pam is new in her role this year, so the two of us together are learning about how we have approached this process in District 38. Okay, again, as we looked at developing this presentation, we looked at policies currently in place, and as you know, we recently did do some revisions to IMB, and then there are also some additional policies that specifically relate to this presentation that have been updated in our policy matrix, and we are not recommending additional revisions at this time.
Unfortunately, the PowerPoint ran out of memory, so we'll try to bring it back up, but Pam, I don't know if you have it in front of you.
I do.
Okay, we can
Yes.
just keep going and we'll try to
Okay.
here in a minute.
Yeah, it's all in the board docs presentation, so we can certainly follow along there. Okay, so our current process for looking at our academic curriculum, and that is what we'll focus on for this presentation, is how we are aligning with the academic standards that the Colorado Department of Education recommends. We do have a curriculum review cycle that we take a look at the resources that we are using every 7 years. And as part of that process, we bring teachers together to look at what the Department of Education is recommending and how those standards align with the resources that we're using. When we see gaps in what our resources are providing that may not necessarily align with the current standards, we may initiate an RFP process and invite vendors in to present. After that, we would make recommendations to the board and provide an opportunity for the community to review proposed resources and provide input. And then finally, we would ask for your approval.
Amber, what is RFP?
Request for proposal?
Proposal.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, on the next slide, you'll see our current practice for reviewing our curriculum. So all the way back to 2016-17 school year through next school year, you can take a look at historically the content that has been reviewed. And as you can see in our current cycle, we're in our first year of our K-5 literacy adoption. We've also reviewed our health standards and resources, and we will be taking a look at physics yet this spring. You'll also notice that last school year, world language was reviewed, and we have some updates on that for you this morning. Over the summer, this past summer, world language teachers came together and began that process, but that process has continued into this first semester of this school year. And then you can take a look at what we have coming up in the 22-23 school year to review. Pam and I will be working closely on continuing this cycle into the future as it only goes through next school year. And as we are working and collaborating closely with colleagues at the Colorado Department of Education, we're considering the need to align our review process closer to what the state's review process is, so that we don't have a significant gap if the state might review a particular content in 1 year, and then it may be several years later when we're reviewing that. We want to make sure that we're more closely in alignment with those standards revisions at the state level.
So other than the state level determining some of the cycling of this, what else determines that? Because I'm noticing that, and I've noticed before, that things are not all on the same cycle, like biology versus math versus PE and health. So it's not that this is an 8-year cycle and it keeps rolling, correct?
That's a very good question, and that's what I've been trying to learn about, is how this came about and what would make sense moving forward.
Sure.
I don't know if you have insights on that, Pam.
Yeah, I think there were some upcoming standards changes, revisions, so that got factored into the schedule. But as far as a philosophy or why some are on a 7-year schedule or 8-year schedule, we don't really know.
I think it'd be helpful to align that with the strategic plan, or somehow be able to communicate out what is the regular rolling cycle and then what things are added due to external factors like the state.
Sure. At the risk of doing my best to describe it, I don't think it's a precise science as much as it is from where the starting point generated. There were budgetary factors into that. There were looks at how long certain resources or curricula were in place. It was sort of at the time that this originated, which I think predates many of us here, kind of a game plan or a strategic approach, but there's nothing telling us that it has to be this and it has to be now. It's our systems knowledge of what's working, what's not, and we can't review everything all at once, because if we review it and then we adopt something, of course, there's a financial commitment to that that's going to, similar to if you're buying devices, every 5 years, well, every 5 years you're going to have a big purchase. So I think it's that semblance of how we came to this point and where things are today. Certainly it's fluid. There's certain elements that can shift or change a year or more. But that's, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. That is the answer that I can.
This has come to my mind before in months and quarters past. And I guess my thought process is, in terms of aligning with strategic plan, can we, as much as possible, make this a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach? And I think there have been some times in past years where I've heard sort of a reactivity, and obviously that happens naturally with the state and other external pressures, for lack of a better term. But as much as D38 can we be proactive?
I think we are.
Okay.
I don't think we aren't.
Okay.
I will say that, like, literacy adoption was a really big process, and we knew that we had to get to where we are now. So you make a good point. There are times when there's going to be an external pressure like CDE expectations that we just have to respond to. But generally speaking, I think we are very proactive. And it represents a proactive stance.
Okay, super. Thanks.
Yep.
Can you explain the difference between when we talk about curriculum versus materials versus resources?
So I call the standards, and I call the standards the curriculum. And then this is a resource. The textbook is a resource. So what we purchase from publishers is a resource.
And that is the focus of this presentation. While we are calling it curriculum, we're talking about our curricular resources today. We could also, I know I've heard you refer to a metaphor that Dr. Benton had used in the past. So I always talk about the written, the taught, and the assessed curriculum. There's all of those pieces, but our focus for this presentation is the resource, the core resource, we might say, that is used for instructing our students.
So I have a couple other questions. So what I'm trying to figure out, and the reason I had asked to learn more and share out, not just for us as a board, but for our community as well, is when we have our curriculum review and we, as a community, come into the Big Red and we have 2 weeks to look at the curriculum, such as our Glencoe Health book, but some of them aren't. So when I was looking forward to, and I'm getting ahead of us, but the foreign language ones, I didn't see the 2-week window on there. Or say, an example is in 2018, we approved as a board a new course offering for college and career writing. And it listed on there what the resource was going to be used for that class, but we didn't actually see the resource. So if we as a board are being asked, well, why did you approve this resource? And we say, we didn't. We trusted that this was the right resource. And then a couple years down the road, a different book is being used instead of the one that was originally presented. So I think that process is where we get confused, and why I ask the questions of what is the process of when the community sees it, when it's brought to the board, and when there has to be a change, whether it's an outdated book or what have you or whatnot. Just there's a process to it, and then I think that consistency and explanation is helpful.
Thank you for that. Yes, we agree with you, and we are planning to, as we move ahead in this presentation, we are planning to ask the community to review both the world language resources as well as the health resource that we are proposing. I believe in board docs it's titled Health Curriculum Review, but if you look at the detail of the notice that will go out, will be an invitation to review all of the resources that we're proposing today. I'm actually going to jump ahead and then back again to your question, Ms. Upchurch. We questioned whether or not to bring forward to the community and to the board our proposal to update our Glencoe Health resource. And in the spirit of all transparency, we chose to do that, even though we're actually not proposing a change. What our proposal is to update the edition that we're currently using. But we'd still want to give the community and the board as well an opportunity to review what has changed from the last time these resources were adopted. Our teachers are currently using the 2014 edition, and as the health teachers came together and reviewed the current academic standards for health, they all were in consensus that the resource that they are currently using is one that is meeting our needs, with the exception that the updated edition is more compatible with our learning management system, which is Canvas. And it also has some updated topics, as you see on this slide here, such as vaping, consumer skills, similar to the digital citizenship conversation we had a moment ago, COVID-19, and opioid drug use. So anything you wanted to add with that process, Pam?
No, the teachers really appreciate the way that Glencoe Health presents all of the topics. They were really excited about the addition of some of the content like vaping. That's become such a big thing in the high schools and middle schools at this point. They were at a complete deficit during remote learning because the 2014 digital version was not compatible, and they had a lot of difficulty uploading PDFs into the learning management system in Canvas. So getting the digital content with this, we'll only be requesting just a class set at each high school of the hard copies, and then everything else will be digital for students. So it'll be really advantageous.
Okay, then we can go back to our recommendation for new world language resources. As I mentioned, teachers did come together over the summer and attempted to create their own resources within Canvas. And as we worked through that process over the summer, we came to a realization that we do need to purchase some core resources that teachers can use for those instructional practices. So as our teachers have collaborated with Pam, these are the resources that they are recommending, and we will have these on display electronically for our community to provide feedback on.
Yeah, our teachers have done a lot of work with the development of their Canvas courses, and then they really thoughtfully went out, and we've been looking for the correct resources to use in those world language classes. So these are teacher developed, with the exception of Wayside Publishing, that's also teacher developed, but they're really classroom-friendly resources for our teachers. So.
Okay, and in board docs, you will see the needs assessment that we've conducted. We are still getting final quotes for our world language resources, but we are piloting those resources currently, and we don't expect those costs to be, we expect the costs to be minimal. We do have an approved budget for curriculum adoption, and we expect that the cost will fit within the budget, and we'll be able to give you those updated numbers at the regular board meeting. We also, as I mentioned at the beginning of this portion of the presentation, we do still need to review our physics resource, and we'll be bringing that to you later this spring. We're happy to answer any questions or partake in any discussion that you might have.
Ron, any questions or comments?
No, thanks.
Matt?
I don't, Mr. Taylor, thank you.
Teresa? Tiffany?
The D38 proposed curriculum review notice, as in accordance with policy AJ, that is an awesome document because it really does support and shows when we do our review. But I'm still curious to learn more as far as how the review process to share out. I may understand being on the board for 5 years now, or on my 5th year, but anybody else in the community or who's new to D38 may not understand the process, and I think that's important to just share out. The work that goes into the review from our teachers, and when I look at the teacher team every time, I'm like, these are amazing educators. We've got amazing educators in our school district looking at our curriculum, but we still get often asked, where is the board in this review process? Where is the community in this review process? And just hypothetically, out of curiosity, I don't think we ever have, but let's just say we as a board, you guys came to us and said, this is what we like, and we said, yeah, we don't. What happens at that point? I'm just curious. I mean, I think this is a good discussion to have to understand the bigger picture.
From my viewpoint,
Sorry.
yes, no, well, I'm going to answer the one about what, if you said you didn't like something, I guess at that point it would be taking you through the curriculum map and through the standards and showing you how the resource aligns. And showing you that work that was done with the staff and the teachers.
And I would also say if the board provided direction that they wanted us to look at specific resources, we would certainly do that and consider those. Absolutely. I don't know if that's answering your question. But we are required to have the approval of the board to adopt new curriculum, and we recognize that. To your question earlier, Ms. Upchurch, my intent would be to bring all new core resources. So when you mentioned world language as an example, if I believe it's our commitment to bring those to you for your review if you would like to look at them in depth. And our community is welcome to do that as well and provide any feedback, which we will certainly consider carefully.
Let me follow up with, did you want to follow up? No, go for it. So, Dr. Benton helped me appreciate curriculum somewhat and the assessment process and sort of this whole area of the growth, the education system. One of the things she talked about was the philosophy of the curriculum itself, right? And so, as an example, and I could be off base, but go with me. I think Monument Academy uses classical education as a curriculum model. There's probably across the street at the Catholic school, they have maybe a Christian model, or I don't know what it is, but in other words, there are different sources of math, English, etc., right, that are based on some foundation that's unique. One of the things I recall asking Dr. Benton is, could we kind of have a working, understanding, not working perhaps, but a discussion understanding of the options that exist in the education world for the philosophy behind the education? So, for example, again, I'm going to come back to Monument Academy. They have a chosen curriculum. One of the things that I hear publicly is that's one of the reasons their choice, right? You choose there because they've chosen a particular curriculum. Not just for world history, but, their overall curriculum. So the question that I'm really trying to get to is, what is our philosophy? What is the D38 philosophy? And what is then the core curriculum? Where's the source of that? And I'm going to use a very recent couple board meetings about No Place for Hate. And its source was the Anti-Defamation League, which raised concerns in our neighborhoods about the source of that particular curriculum. And I heard many, many, many parents say, while I agree with the points or the emphasis, if you will, they had trouble with the source. So how does our policies address source of curriculum and its philosophy, if you will? Does that make sense?
It does, and you had a lot in that question, so let me say a little bit, and maybe Dr. Summers might want to chime in as well. So if you look back at the 2016 to 2023 curriculum review cycle that we had in the slides, you'll notice that these are all academic areas. And so I would say our current approach, I kind of think of it as our approach to instruction versus the resources used. I can't speak specifically to the resources that MA has adopted, but I do know that many schools who adopt a traditional approach, a core knowledge approach, if you will, many use CKLA, which is a curriculum that we also use. I would say, though, generally as a district, our approach or instructional philosophy has been standards-based. And so that's what you see in this curriculum revision cycle. And what you don't see is social emotional learning here, because those are not standards that are adopted by the Department of Education, nor that we have adopted as a district at this time. So I know we're going to be looking closer at how our approach to character education and social emotional learning will look in the future. I believe that'll be coming up at the regular board meeting. And we recognize that that is not currently part of this process that we're talking about today. I don't know that I fully answered your question, but I certainly appreciate that.
You really did. I understand better. The question that I'm going to come back, even in the academic setting, there are alternatives. And I would like to have some ability to speak to those alternatives, which means you need to educate the community about what the alternatives is and why are we where we are. Does that make sense? Because I know there's alternatives. And I think that's kind of the process here is, these are the options available for core curriculum, if you will, in your education system. This is where we're at for whatever reason, right? And we don't use Christian-based because it's separation of church and state. You see where I'm going with that? I would just like to be able to talk about it with my neighbors intelligently, and I can't yet.
Two relevant policies that will help reframe or frame and reinforce the conversation, and Amber hit on this. Policy AEA, which interestingly was last revised in September of 2015, so maybe an opportunity for us to at least revisit, maybe without major revision, but a few lines here. The board supports a system of education that develops and teaches standards that enable students to achieve the highest level of knowledge and skills. Academic standards clearly identify what students should know and be able to do at key points in their school careers. And in accordance with state law, the board has adopted a standards-based education system which focuses on student learning of district's academic standards. There is more, but that's the bulk of it. And then curriculum development, which is policy IG, also speaks to the board being required by state law to determine the educational programs to be carried out in the schools of the district. The curricula provided throughout the district shall be aligned to approved academic standards to ensure that each student will have the educational experiences needed to achieve the standards or complete the requirements and goals as listed on a student's individual education program. So all that to say, this was last updated August of 2016. And there's more, and I think, I don't mean to shortchange the entirety of the policy, but I think it speaks to a standards-based educational system. Granted, there may be different points of view on what those are. What I would actually encourage us to do as we're continuing with these efforts is really dig into, well, what are those standards? Because there is a scope and a sequence that is laid out, that is well crafted, that is well measured and assessed so that we know exactly how our students are progressing in terms of what they know and are able to do, which, and then as we think about our profile of the graduate and all the other components that come into focus here, really symbolizes the process by which our education system is built. The thing that I would also stress is that within the system there is an honoring and a respect for student individuality and their future of their choice. We are not trying to teach kids this is what you should think as much as we are supporting their process of thinking and becoming the citizen that they are meant to become as a function of a partnership with our district, our teachers obviously that are making this happen, all of our staff and our families, our parents. So all of that, I think, perhaps, I think to your point, Ms. Upchurch, it's just helping clarify. When people ask you that question, what does this process look like? There's the steps in the process, but then I think it's also getting back to the bigger whole, because I do believe that there's sometimes a perception or misperception that we're trying to do unto as opposed to do with. And that really would be my overall classification of this whole process is we are doing this together, but what are those opportunities for involvement and engagement, and what happens if I have a different point of view? We welcome all those points of view, and we have to ultimately make decisions that are going to be consistent with the policies, the practices that we set forth, as well as the expectations that we have. So I can go on, but I'll just put a period at the end of that and leave it at that for the moment.
May I? So that's what, to your point, and I completely concur. And I think a great model and an example is what Mrs. Kern and Mrs. Day had set up at Lewis Palmer Elementary School, that when there was resources coming into the building, we sat at those DAC tables and we as parents were engaged in that process. And recognizing that it was the teacher's team, like the first grade team, that brought this up and brought this to us. But because we were a part of the process, we understood and we acknowledged and we got to ask the correct questions or incorrect questions, but it was a discussion. And to your point, also, when it says right in those policies that the board, so if it's the board, then I think what Chris is saying is when we get asked those questions as a board member, I want to make sure it's, for me, and no disrespect to any teacher's team that picks a curriculum or a resource, I do want to make sure that parents are involved and that the board understands what decisions are being made and how, and that we really are teaching how to think, not what to think. And I'm going to give an example. I'm just going to be frank. A resource was presented to me, and I saw this resource, and I thought, well, this is just blah, blah, blah. And then I started reading the resource, and I thought, I wouldn't want my kid learning this. This is not how I want my child to learn. This is telling my child what to think, not how to think. And I can go into details about the resource later. It's not that important or to this conversation, but the point is, it's a big picture, and I think that if we, as a community of parents and teachers and educators and leaders are looking at this together, I think that that really does help to understand the why behind what we do. Does that make sense?
And the one other thing I would just echo in that, and there are other policies that inform this as well, is anytime there is a question that a parent has, we are absolutely ready and willing to have that conversation. So we would encourage, the first step in that process usually is with the teacher. So we don't ever want a parent to just jump to some conclusion without first having the opportunity to ask that question, to clarify it, and then we're in a position to offer that support, whatever that needs to look like in whatever those situations are. So I think sometimes it can get lost in context when we don't have the opportunity to have the dialogue, which is so critical to how all this comes together.
Excellent. 2 follow-ups. One is, I heard we do not have similar policy for academics similar policy for SEL as we do for academics. Is that what I heard?
We do have some policies that address that. I don't have those at the ready, but we don't have academic approved standards or state-driven standards related to
That's a topic
that.
I'd like to bring up again at another work session, is those SEL policies and the standards, whatever they might be, that we want to follow to, ensure that there's transparency. That's the second point I wanted to make, is just as we went through a financial audit every year in order to try and have greater financial transparency, I think curriculum is more important for transparency. So I'm not suggesting we get an audit. I don't know who would do it, et cetera. But I'm just elevating the importance of curriculum to the highest level possible in terms of transparency with our parents, community, teachers, students, et cetera.
I think Dr. Summers might have said this, but just for the public to know that if a parent wanted to review any of our curricular resources at any time, they're more than welcome to do that. And with these new resources, we'll be working with Mr. Belcher to let our community know that they are invited to come here beginning tomorrow to take a look at any of these proposed resources, and we welcome any feedback that they may have.
Thank you. Anything else on this topic? Again, great appreciation for your efforts, and it's much appreciated.
Great. Thank you.
Our next topic is policy update. B2. We got past B1. There's a lot packed into that B1. So, Dr. Summers and Kristen, I believe.
So we actually have 2 topics that we just want to cover at least briefly with you. The first is under an introduction to a policy that will be a first reading coming up on February 22nd. That is GBAA. Ms. Tieber, would you like to just touch on what we're looking at here?
Sure. This is as I'm reviewing the G policies, this is one that felt like needed some attention. What you have in front of you is the CASB policy with additions in red. And in looking at this policy, I felt like there was a lack of specificity and some items that just needed clarity. An example is the definition of sexual harassment, the definition of sexual violence. So those are just some examples of changes that I'm recommending, and this is currently under legal review.
So just to clarify, there are no CASB changes per se?
There are no CASB changes.
Okay, and so what we see are the changes that you've
Correct.
made? Okay, thank you.
Correct. And I think about the policy, I believe, was reviewed by CASB in 2012, and a lot has happened in our world since 2012, so that's where some of the changes originate.
I noticed there's a few little grammar changes that need to be taking place, so we could just send that to you directly.
Okay. You want to touch on the policy matrix or no?
Well, there isn't, I don't think this has been completely updated. Amber mentioned earlier, there's a few others that we have reviewed with the recommendation for no changes at this time. So we would like to make sure that that updated matrix is available for review on the 22nd. However, with your permission, we would like to briefly touch on something that was brought up at the last regular meeting in regards to IKF, keeping in mind that we do have our second reading upcoming for February 22nd. So with that, we do have one more presentation that Ms. Wettstein will lead.
Thank you. In board docs, you'll see just a couple of slides, a few slides to hopefully address some of the questions and discussion that occurred at our last meeting. One of the questions was in regard to distance learning partnerships that is mentioned in IKF, and in reviewing some of our course handbooks and consulting with Ms. Jess McAllister, our secondary programs coordinator. The primary partnership that we currently access is with BYU Online, but we do have some other institutions that are accredited that our students have taken advantage of from time to time, as well as students are able to propose credit through a distance learning accredited institution, and that occurs at the school level where the counselors review that accreditation and make a collaborative decision whether to accept those credits prior to the student participating in those programs. We also took a look at pros and cons related to the idea of beginning credit accumulation in middle school. You can see here that our surrounding districts typically do not allow for credit accumulation before grade 9. Douglas County does have some very specific classes that they accept. As I reviewed their policy, and D49 does accept credit beginning in middle school. When we took a look at pros and cons, and this was something that counselors weighed in on, gifted and talented facilitators weighed in on, principals weighed in on, and as well as our executive team with our experiences, you'll see that there are some pros that are identified as students might be recognized for completing high school coursework during middle school. We do have students who are currently taking higher level math classes, for example, in middle school. Students who take high school coursework might have more options. If they complete their math credits early, they potentially could take more elective classes. And students may graduate early, were some of the pros that we came up with. Conversely, students may experience undue stress or pressure to accelerate too quickly should we offer this opportunity for students, and they may not choose to fulfill their potential in a given content area, such as math, if they complete those credits early. Students may graduate too early and not be developmentally ready for the world. And as well as some concern was brought up about needing tight alignment in how we deliver the content at the middle school level with how we do that at the high school level, which currently is not in place. Our teachers are very attuned to the needs of middle school students, and they are delivering that instruction appropriately for middle school. It may not match exactly how that content is delivered at a high school with a high school student's age. So at this time, we are not recommending a change to our current practice or policy. We want to maintain a supportive environment for our middle school students, and there are too many factors at this time that would need to be considered if we were to examine students beginning to accumulate credit in 7th grade, and you see those there. Happy to entertain any further discussion on that or additional questions.
Since I'm the one that asked this question, and first of all, I want to say that I appreciate so much how your team and you staff have been very attuned and responsive to when we're asking questions in the board meeting, that you bring follow-up information and further information into the discussion. I appreciate that so much. Since I brought this up, I appreciate this and I appreciate the recommendation. I guess my question was, and I saw that Douglas County and D49, I also looked into them afterwards too. Say you have a student who's excelled in math and then gets to Palmer Ridge High School and they're out of math options without having to provide transportation to, say, Lewis Palmer High School. Do some of these online courses give them more opportunities? Let's say you have a student, I'm trying to think of the example, but let's say you have a student that has excelled and is already in high school math classes by the time they're in 8th grade, and they want to take that advanced calculus class, but it's just not offered in their high school building. That was kind of what made me wonder about those kinds of questions.
Yes, I would say there are multiple opportunities for students to continue to advance, either through online classes. We have a partnership with the Colorado Digital Learning Solution that offers online courses, but we also might encourage a student to take advantage of concurrent enrollment options, so college level instruction as well. So we would most certainly work with students to meet their individual needs in those circumstances.
Anything else on this issue? Thank you very much. The next topic is B3, board listening sessions.
Okay, so one more document here. This one is a PDF that is in your board packet. So we'd like to summarize this, perhaps not with going through this line by line, but just reiterating the purpose of these sessions, which at this point, our latest iteration with a brainstorm that Mr. Belcher and I had was engage and elevate with D38. So we're looking for some kind of way to really encourage participation and an invitation for all of our stakeholders to continue to engage with us with the purpose of really gathering feedback and developing a shared understanding within our strategic plan and our efforts within it. So as we think about the design of these sessions, and then we have some questions here at the end, we are wanting to take advantage of the ability to really go a little bit deeper within 3 of our priorities, really priorities 1, 2, and 3, to talk more about that, but really the focus is going to be more on listening and gathering feedback. So what we would envision are some small focus groups that would be assembled within a variety of contexts, and that'll get into our questions here a little bit. So if I can, I'll just kind of high level this proposed agenda. Of course, we would envision a welcome and an introduction and an overview of what to expect. Do a very brief 5-minute overview of our strategic plan, and then we would launch into a series of 4 topics for conversation and feedback. The first of those would actually be our profile of a graduate. We'd like to start with that so that we can share the background, allow community the opportunity to interact with that profile, and then allow small groups to process through a series of questions. So you can get the sort of feel of the series of questions, starting with what resonates, what other skills or ICANN statements may be necessary for our graduates, or what other questions and additional suggestions do you have? So if you think about that being like a 10 or 12 minute mini sort of a breakout, depending on how many small groups we have and the ability for all those small groups to share out at least one piece of feedback related to each of those 3 questions, that would be the same format that we would then see with priority 1, 2, and 3. For us, it would be really important, and we'd want to spend a little more time both with the priority champion and the board member that is attached to that particular priority, or a combination thereof. What would be the initiatives that we would want to elevate in the conversation, keeping in mind that there's a lot of different details that we can go into. But I think we know relatively what our top 2 or 3 initiatives would be within each of our priority areas. Keeping in mind that within those conversations, there's a lot of places that people can go. So we want to allow that fluidity and that open-ended dialogue to occur, but the structure would really keep us moving pretty briskly in a manner that would allow us to then have some time toward the end to really summarize continuing opportunities to engage. Right now, the current thought is that the budgeting process that we're about to go into would be something that we would roll out or introduce, but not expect people to complete all in the session. It's really going to be an interactive opportunity that anybody can access, whether they're in the session or not. So that would be through our balancing act tool. And then I think, as I've mentioned to many of you, we are in the process of developing a more thorough community survey that, again, would be broadcast out to as many people in our community as possible. So that would be another connection and rollout, and then an opportunity for some additional feedback, open conversation, or closure. Start to finish, we're thinking about 90 minutes for each of these sessions. So this leads us to our questions, and then opportunity for more considerations here. One is just how many of these sessions are we able to facilitate? And who will be facilitating these sessions, and as well, where will we want to facilitate these sessions? I think we initially were thinking a blend of maybe virtual and in-person. The more we're looking at this type of a format, we think that in-person interaction would be most ideal in terms of how we're encouraging folks to be present and to show up. As far as who do we expect to attend and how big of an audience, I think that's just something we have to prepare for. And then as well, the start time, end time, just some of those logistics. Currently, we're thinking the possibility of a 4:30 to a 6 p.m. Start time, end time, which would allow folks to potentially come after school if you're a teacher or a staff member. It may not work for as many parents as what we'd hope, and so we want to, obviously give ourselves some room to be flexible there. I know I covered that really fast, so I'm sure there's probably quite a few thoughts and questions. We did not put dates to this particular version of the PDF as of yet, but we were thinking that we would be potentially ready with some preparation to have all this ready to launch as early as the beginning of March, and then focus really from March through April. Probably want to have these wrapped up by early May, at least for this school year, recognizing that this presents an opportunity for us to be more refined and thoughtful about how this process can continue subsequently into next school year and beyond.
Several thoughts. One is, if you'll scroll up to your 3 priorities, there's a second question, I think. It says, what other initiatives or actions may benefit D38 through this priority? I would say almost what I heard you say, and that is, what other initiatives or actions should D38 elevate through this priority for our system or for our children or something along those lines?
Nice reframe.
And I would do that in all 3, just it captures your title better.
Nice.
Second is, I don't know that we can go to, how many buildings are there? Is there 9?
So we have
8?
8 plus, if you think about Grace Best as being one of our facilities as well. So you could make the argument 9, and potentially Monument Academy as well. So you could even say possibly 10.
I'm gonna suggest this. 90 minutes or 2 hours, it's gonna take some time, right? I'm wondering if we don't do one in Palmer Lake, which covers the whole west side. We do one perhaps here, or the middle school that covers Lewis Palmer Elementary, Palmer Ridge High School, and middle school. We do one at Kilmer that picks up Monument East and Prairie Winds, and do, one in Lewis Palmer High School or Bear Creek for the south side, and that kind of gives us 4, and invite multiple schools. It's just an idea. I'm not suggesting it.
We've been toggling between some of those ideas as well. So we thought about it perhaps from a leveled perspective, like an elementary, a middle, a high school type focus. That's one way to look at it. What you just suggested, we would support as a geographic sort of a breakdown. I think part of the key to this is all are welcome to attend. So that would be with enough time to advertise and to encourage getting the word out. That would be something that we could envision as well.
There are a number of parents that have kids in both areas, so.
Sure.
Anyway, those are my 2 thoughts. Any thoughts or follow-up questions? Ron?
My only follow-on question is, if this works out well, can we continue it into other school years so we keep the community engaged and our feedback fresh?
Absolutely. This would be something that we would love to continue to build upon going forward.
Good. Anything else, Ron?
No, thank you.
Matt? Teresa?
I was just thinking from the end point backwards. So, and looking at the questions that you have for the priorities, what would we do with that information? We're going to have a whole bunch of information about what resonates with stakeholders, ICANN statements, and questions and suggestions, and then what? What do you envision?
Sure. So I think the first step is obviously collecting all of that information, organizing it, beginning to analyze it for themes. Certainly we'll have quite a bit of affirmations, I would assume. We might have some, for lack of a better term, other things that tell us, well, no, we don't support this, or you need to do more of something else. So obviously, as we're compiling all of that and then processing all of that together, I think what that represents is just good feedback that really becomes feed forward. So then how do we use that feedback? I think that's a question for this governance team and for what that represents as an element of how we continue to want to move this forward. I do think there may be things that we're just not quite thinking about right now that gives us room to certainly question where does that fit? How much of that do we need to put into some additional context? The other thing I would probably presume is there may be things that may be very helpful as far as what we're hearing, but it might be isolated feedback or what's the term? Feedback that's not necessarily shared by a large percentage of people. And if that's the case, that's not to say that it's not good feedback. It just means how much does it fit within the context of how we're continuing to elevate and engage with our strategic plan. But I'm curious, is that along the lines of what I'm trying to read?
Yeah.
Your facial expression and say, what else, Ms. Phillips?
My facial expression. It looks like an awful lot packed into a short period of time.
Say that one more time.
It looks like an awful lot packed into a short period of time.
Okay.
Meaning I'm wondering if we should separate out the priorities to different meetings. And maybe we didn't talk about that. Just because 10 to 12 minutes to get everybody's feedback on one priority could feel very rushed. And I guess it's the quality of the feedback that matters as well in terms of being a starting point and moving forward.
So in all transparency, we definitely were deliberating over if we were to take a singular priority focus at any particular meeting. I think the advantage to that is potentially, yes, we could go a lot deeper within that specific priority. I think potentially a disadvantage to that is, well, you have me here. I'd love to talk about more than just this priority. So where else does that go? And if part of what we're saying is how do you blend the two, perhaps we allow people to select a particular priority for a deep dive focus. That might be one way to go at it. I would hate for somebody to come to a meeting and say, you're only giving me the opportunity to talk about priority 1. Why can't we talk about priority 2 or priority 3? On the flip side of that, I don't want 10 to 12 minutes to feel like, oh my gosh, you gave me no time whatsoever to provide that level of feedback. So if there's a way to do both, I think that's where we're trying to get.
And may I
do both well.
I agree. The question is excellent because, you know, how much do you get out of it? And I love the idea of getting higher quality feedback. But the overlap is, as we see, we constantly talk about one of the priorities and it bleeds into 1, 2, or 3 all the time. So the separation has its just, you know, drawbacks as well.
One way we can easily adjust this, and again, please know we're not completely married to how this is living in front of you right this second, is that you assemble into a small group. You have a small group facilitator. We are going to ask you to get to as many of these prompts related to each of our top 3 priorities as you possibly can get. We're not going to sit here and do a whole bunch of back and forth. We're going to give you 60 minutes to go there. The hard part with that is, again, I do think you're going to have some folks that say, well, I really want to talk about this. So is there an opportunity to self-organize into a like-minded or an affinity type of a small group? Or is there more of a, no, we really want you to get to every part of what we're putting in front of you through the lens of more of the comprehensive strategic plan? So I think those are some of the things that we're still sorting out.
And it does add to Teresa's question about who facilitates these, because you talk about facilitating the big meeting, but you really have these groups that probably the facilitation is even more important at priority 1, 2, and 3 subgroups, if you will. Whoever facilitates that is going to be key to the quality of feedback. And
I would go so far as to say we're probably looking at the majority of facilitators with 2 on the phone as well that we want to make sure to loop into this. But what I'm wondering, and I don't want to shortchange any other questions here, is there an opportunity to perhaps, and Ms. Phillips, if you're maybe open to being part of this, Ms. Upchurch or whoever else, I know Priority 5 work sort of connects to a lot of this. But if there's an opportunity for us to refine this just a little bit more, but we need to get a schedule together is the other thing. And so if we're looking toward early March as our first meeting, then I want to make sure that we have enough time to communicate that and prepare accordingly.
I'm glad to help and meet between now and February 22nd, if that's helpful.
Appreciate that.
Because I think we can short up just a little bit and then communicate it out really as effectively as possible, because we want our stakeholders to feel invited and very much heard.
Yes.
And we also want to get feedback that we can utilize and maximize.
Yes.
I would agree, and I could meet too, because I think the idea is to talk with our community, not at.
Absolutely.
That comes through quite clearly. And shoring it up, when I look at this, and I thought, well, when we look at starting with the profile of a graduate, as a kindergarten parent, they may not be that interested in that topic, but they may be very interested in knowing how we're going to educate their elementary school student, or what curriculum we're going to use for their elementary school student as it aligns to priority 2. So I think that I hear what you're saying of how that seemed like to pack a lot in, but I think if the more folks we can get and the more feedback we can get, different things are going to be of interest to different folks.
And to you're totally supporting this issue of quality, right? I mean, I appreciate this. I I think we should start, number one, and learn. And as Ron said, we're going to make this kind of an ongoing process. So we don't have to perfect it out of the gate. In fact, we can't. So I share your concerns, but I think the bigger issue for me is let's start. Because it's been over 2 years since we've really engaged with our community in this form. And I think just starting is going to help us a lot. And your points, I guarantee you'll attend a couple of these meetings and say, oh, what we should try. And that's perfect. That's what we want. That's education in and of itself, right? Ongoing, continuous improvement.
So just quick, from a logistical angle, would you guys prefer that we identify some potential dates? We weren't ready to kind of go into date mode right here on the spot, but I think we can take a step toward identifying those. Time frame, I'm just curious, just real quick, is there a preference on a 4:30 to a 6, or a 6 to a 7:30, or a, what's our sweet spot there?
I think that 4:30 to 6 definitely benefits staff and teachers. I think that there will be some parents that may not be able to make that time frame. So I didn't know if we were looking for consistency across the calendar in terms of same time. But like we talked about, if we could offer an evening one, that might help some people attend.
I wonder if we could do a blend. Okay, so, and then we can work on a draft schedule that we can circulate just so that we can get calendars set, and then with time to really refine more of the process ahead of it. I appreciate, right, it's not going to be everything that we want it to be all at once, but we can get going and learn from that and continue to continuously improve on it from there. Great. So we'll work on getting some dates to you here in the next day or two, so that we can start working toward calendars and moving forward from there. And we appreciate more and more feedback around even the process itself.
Excellent work session today. B4 is a legislative update, and since it's early in the session, I'm going to pass, if you guys don't mind. There's nothing to report really yet.
Yeah, actually, that's all I was going to say is this is important to have it on or start having it as part of our work session. It's not something that's been a part of our discussion since I've been on the board that much, just occasionally. And in getting feedback from other school boards, it is a part of their board discussion during the legislative session. But yeah, we spent 3 hours on the Legislative Review Committee on Friday and with other board members throughout the state, and things haven't even gotten hopping yet. So there's still a lot to go. There's going to be some initiatives on the ballot possibly as it applies to education, but there's no real update right now.
While you have the mic, do you want to do board member reflections?
I've reflected a lot today.
Teresa?
I don't have any comments, thanks.
Matt? I haven't heard him for a while. Ron, any reflections?
Nothing further, thank you.
And I'm just going to end with thank you to everybody. This was a lot, maybe too much, because I felt like I wanted to continue every aspect of this meeting. So thank you, and I appreciate most of all how you're educating me. I'm learning so much every time we have a work session. One question is, do you guys like the seating arrangement?
The thing that comes to mind is that if anybody enters the door here, screens are visible. So I don't know if people have, confidentiality or privacy issues, but just something to consider.
Yeah, that is a concern always. But the concept here was that it's more us, right? And we kind of spread around a bit. And this is like having little workout sessions, right? And that we are closer to the people that we focus on our priorities with, and et cetera. It was just to see how it goes. So think about it and provide feedback to Casey or me, and we can modify.
If we do want to keep it, I might recommend getting a couple more mics, maybe some mic stands, so that we can have equitable mic access. So.
Perfect.
I have feedback on it.
When do we meet again? February 24th?
Feb 1. Feb 22 for the board meeting. We wouldn't do it for the board meeting. Right.
February 22nd. So we'll stand adjourned until February 22nd. Thank you.
Casey, I like this.
Thanks, everyone.